Hello, come in. Hi, right. You find me today standing over by the sort of Chinese and Eastern corner. It's mainly here. I've got wonderful books of translations of Chinese poetry, a very beautiful thing of the Lin Yu Tang. And I've been looking over here. This is a really treasured volume. Madly Singing in the Mountains, Arthur Waley. Arthur Waley was one of a pioneering translator of Chinese poetry, and it was through his translations that I first came to know and love Chinese poetry. But he was a contemporary of people like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and they were very influenced by the way he translated Chinese poetry. And I've been looking at this. The actual title of the book, Madly Singing in the Mountains, is the title of a poem he translates. It's absolutely wonderful, by the poet Po Chi. And the reason why I've been looking at this is that a wonderful thing happened just yesterday. At last, there arrived in the post from Hong Kong a book of my own poetry translated beautifully into Chinese and illustrated beautifully, my poems on the sayings of Jesus. And I just felt, I spent so long looking at Chinese poetry and sometimes wondering if I could understand the characters and reading it in English. It's just a joy to know that my poems are translated into Chinese. Just before we go over and look at that, let me just, I'll just read to you while I'm standing here, the poem Madly Singing in the Mountains. I really identify with the poet in this. So this poem was written in about the year 816, so the early 9th century in China. There is no one among men that has not a special failing, and my failing consists in writing verses. I have broken away from the thousand ties of life, but this infirmity still remains behind. Each time that I look at a fine landscape, each time that I meet a loved friend, I raise my voice and recite a stanza of poetry, and am glad as though a god had crossed my path. Ever since the day I was banished to Xinjiang, half my time I've lived among the hills, and often when I have finished a new poem, alone I climb the road to the eastern rock. I lean my body on the banks of white stone. I pull down with my hands a green cassia branch. My mad singing startles the valleys and hills. The apes and birds all come to peep, fearing to become a laughing stock to the world. I choose a place that is unfrequented by men. I love that of the old poet. His last infirmity is still to keep writing verses, and who goes up into the hills to sing them. But I was only reading that because I've been sort of reviving the Chinese thing, because, let's get it here. Here it is. Look, I'm just so pleased with this. It's wonderful. You see all the beautiful Chinese characters on the back. And this lovely, and the whole book is called Darkness-Lightening Lantern. And I'll tell you about where that is. Let's go, come and sit down. It's translated, here's the little kind of preface. It's translated by a very fine scholar and poet, Chinese Christian called Haiyan Zhang, who's based in the States but often visits China. It's been published in Hong Kong very beautifully. And in addition, it's a parallel text, so it gives you my poem and the little passage that precedes it on one side, and then it gives you the beautiful Chinese characters of the poem on the other. But and I wrote a little preface for it, which is all in Chinese here. Obviously I didn't write it in Chinese, it's been translated. And I'll read you the opening words of that preface. I'm greatly honoured that Professor Zhang has chosen to translate these poems of mine into Chinese. Since I was a young man, I have read Chinese poetry translated into English, and admired its beauty and the skill of the translators who could make a bridge between our worlds. So it's a special pleasure to know that some of my own poetry may be read in Chinese. Now, in fact, the book of mine that Professor Zhang chose to translate is called Parable and Paradox, and it's 50 sonnets on the sayings of Jesus. And those are the sonnets that he wanted to translate. And he's obviously, in a sense, it's not just a literal translation, he's remade them as Chinese poetry. But he felt right at the core of them was the poem I wrote about the Beatitudes, about the wonderful, wise, profound, all-transforming sayings of Jesus, the ones like, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And it's part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, nobody who has a light sticks it under a bushel, but sets it up on a hill where it can be seen. And I use that image in my poem about the Beatitudes, of this lantern we've been given, this light, in the sayings of Jesus, to keep us in some light in the darkness until the sun really rises and the dawn comes on the world. And that seemed to have a particular resonance for this Chinese translator, and he felt it would for Chinese readers. So here's the Beatitudes themselves translated into Chinese, and then my poem. And I thought I'd perhaps read you this poem, because this, in a sense, is the title poem. Maybe just before I do, let me just show you some of the illustrations here. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful nature illustration with the deer and the bird? And there's another one, drawing on images from my poems, but also just there's the lamb in the midst of it. I just think that's so lovely. Anyway, here is my poem on the Beatitudes, from which this book takes its title. I only wish I could recite it to you in Chinese as well, but I don't have that skill. I bless you who have spelt your blessings out and set this lovely lantern on a hill, lightening darkness and dispelling doubt by lifting for a little while the veil. For longing is the veil of satisfaction, and grief the veil of future happiness. I glimpse beneath the veil of persecution the coming kingdom's overflowing bliss. O make me pure of heart, and help me see amongst the shadows and amidst the mourning the promised comforter alive and free, the kingdom coming and the sun returning, that even in this pre-dawn dark I might at once reveal and revel in your light. I wondered in a way if that poem, which might have a particular fittingness for its Chinese audience, also has a fittingness for us in these dark COVID days. But we're beginning to see that a light is coming, aren't we? We're beginning to see that there's a dawn, and perhaps even in this pre-dawn dark we might at once reveal and revel in the light that's been given to us. So I put this on my shelf with all my other books there, with a sense of wonder and gratitude that somebody wanted to go to the labour of making my poetry available in a whole other world and language. Thanks for dropping by.